So today we're going to be talking about visual rhetoric. In our last lecture, we talked about rhetorical concepts, rhetorical situation, and exegesis. Well, how do we apply those things to things that we see, not just the things that we read and write? This is part of something called composition, which you guys have probably been familiar with if you took an AP language and comp class or a lit and comp class in high school. So composition is how do we create things rhetorically, not just necessarily how do we write an essay, but how do we create all kinds of genres. Visual rhetoric would be very prevalent for our design your own project, for our big research project, because you will have to compose an artifact or a text, something that is visual. Um, so the way that we can interpret things rhetorically, visually, becomes important for this. So what is visual rhetoric specifically? Visual rhetoric is how are we persuaded by things that we see with our eyes? Not just the things that we read and write, but how can we rhetorically engage with something? And if something is even rhetorical at all. When we think about rhetoric, we often think about how language choices impact the way that we persuade somebody. But it doesn't have to just be written or oral. It can also be used to persuade people to believe or act a certain way just by looking at something. So when we talk about visual rhetoric, we might be inclined to think about how images are manipulated to sort of skew the things that we perceive, but it doesn't have to manipulate in a necessarily negative connotation. It can be positive as well. So it's more than just manipulating the image. It also refers to how we, the audience, can interpret and make meaning out of the things that we see. So to build on how we can begin to evaluate visual rhetoric, it should describe how the visual elements are being used. And so we can think about, is something static? Is it staying in one place? Is it moving like a GIF? Is it animated? Or is it textual? Because text can be, we read text all the time, and that can be part of the visual rhetoric elements. But more importantly, are we trying to persuade an audience to think, feel, or act on something? Those are the key things that when we are making these rhetorical choices visually, are we persuading an audience to think, act, or feel a certain way? So we can take a lot of the similar concepts from our last lecture about ethos, logos, pathos, kairos, rhetorical situation, and exigence, and think about these, but through pictures or some other sort of visual genre. So here are some of the ways that visual rhetoric tends to pop up. You can think about fonts. So if a serif font, which is meant to sort of mimic like a typewriter, serif fonts, so Times New Roman, Garamond, or you have sans serif fonts, Comic Sans, Arial, the ones that are supposed to mimic handwriting. Those are rhetorical visual choices that we can make. Size and style is something small and bolded, large and italicized, combination thereof. Space versus negative space is another big one. So if something takes up space, that is rhetorically relevant, right? Because if something's taking up space, we're meant to have our attention drawn to it. But negative space refers to the absence of something. So if you've ever seen if you've ever seen a website where there's a bunch of text and then there's these big white columns and there's like nothing else going on, that's called negative space. And negative space, rhetorically speaking, can be just as relevant. Even though it may look empty, it's actually drawing your eyes to the thing that's the most important, because that's the thing you should be focusing on. Another thing to think about is color. What colors are being used and for what purpose? I remember back in the early days of the internet when people were just getting into website creation, and the big thing that people would joke about is the bright green background with bright pink text letters. And those are horrid color combinations. They're difficult to read. So there were no rhetorical choices. People were just vibing with the colors. But if we're thinking about color contrast and accessibility, when we make those specific color choices, that's something we consider with visual rhetoric. The other thing is imagery. Are there pictures, GIFs, graphics? Those are, again, rhetorical visual choices we can make. Position and order is another one. So if we're thinking about position and order, where are things positioned on the page and in what order are we supposed to read them? It sounds self-explanatory, but it can actually be a little bit more complicated than that. So how somebody chooses to design and position and order something in order for an audience to read it the way that it's supposed to be read. That's a visual rhetorical choice that we can make. So the important thing to emphasize with visual rhetoric is that it starts with what we see coming into our eyes, and it ends with us being able to interpret and make meaning out of something. So your author, your writer, your compositionist creates an artifact for you to interpret rhetorically. Then you, as the audience, look at it, do a series of thought processes, and then you can interpret and make meaning after that. Let's dig in further to that. If we start with our visual input, the thing that is coming into our eyes, what do we see at first glance? It might be color, it might be size, it might be a host of things. Then as we examine it further, we as the audience, as the person creating meaning and trying to interpret it, begin to add context to that image. Is it a specific genre? What more information do I need to understand the image? Next, consider how we could become persuaded by the messaging. Do we see ethos, logos, pathos, and kairos? How is the image working to persuade us rhetorically? After we have gone through all of those thought processes, we can develop meaning. We can try and interpret what the meaning of an artifact. What is the messaging, and is it rhetorically effective? Not that you necessarily have to agree with the messaging, but is it trying to make us act, think, or feel a certain way? Those are the key tenets of visual rhetoric. Let's take a look at this graphic here. So if visual rhetoric starts with what we see with our eyes, there's our visual input, right? We see something at first glance or even a second glance, and we have visual input. We are seeing it with our eyes. And the things that we see could be a whole bunch of different things. It can be color, layout, shapes, typography, so like fonts and size, nature, so do we recognize natural images or landscapes? Architecture, that's again like the structure of something, the position and order, all sorts of things. So we see something and we can identify what we see. Then we begin to add context. So do we think about genre, language, culture, timing, life experiences? All of these things help us with the way that we interpret something. And then we start to think rhetorically. Do we see the reasoning or the logos behind something? Do we see the emotion or pathos of what's happening? And is there credibility? Do we trust the ethos of the thing that we're looking at? And after we've gone through all these different cognitive processes, we have meaning. So visual rhetoric is more than just going like creating something for vibes. It can be, but it requires several steps of cognitive processes in order for us to eventually make meaning. The things I want you to remember when it comes to visual rhetoric, that visual rhetoric is intentional. All the content that you consume uses visual rhetoric in some capacity, and it's designed with specific audiences in mind. Just like when you write an essay, you have an intended audience. So does visual rhetoric. So do artifacts that require us to think rhetorically and visually. But if you think a choice was made by accident, it wasn't. It was intentional 100% of the time. The other thing to remember is that visual rhetoric is also contextual. Just like if you were evaluating somebody's paper, it requires context for us to really understand. So it might be meant to engage a specific community or even a specific individual, but those things, that context is important for us to understand the rhetorical situation of something visually. And then finally, it takes a position. It's not just an image for the sake of being an image. If it's meant to make us think, act, or feel a certain way, then it's taking a position on something and it is demanding that the audience also take a position, either the same position or the opposite position. So think about like propaganda. The propaganda memes that we might see on the internet. Those things demand us to feel, act, or think a certain way, whether it's that we agree with it or disagree. That's visual rhetoric working. It could also just be, it could just be that it's a picture of blue curtains and the curtains are blue. Or it could be that the blue curtains remind us of something. It reminds us of how we feel at a certain time of year, right? There's more than just blue curtains happening sometimes. And sometimes a picture of blue curtains is just blue curtains. But it could also be that we are meant to look beyond the curtains to understand what's actually happening in the image.